And as is customary, we end with a bit of a bang, because with us today we have Professor Ned Lebow. He is an American political scientist, best known for his work on international relations and international relations theory. Professor Lebow is in much demand, so much demand that he splits his time between the University of Cambridge, Dartmouth in the United States, and King's College London. He is an exceedingly prolific writer, publishing a great many books that appear and reappear in footnotes and on reading lists. Most recently, he has been the co-author of a book called Return of the Theorists, Dialogues with Dead Thinkers. He's written the book National Identifications and International Relations, and Constructing Cause in International Relations, all of these at Cambridge University Press. He's also published a book in 2014 called Goodbye Hegemony, Power and Influence in the Global System. And this chimes with the title for his presentation today. Professor Ned Lebow is here to address us on the topic of the consequences of America's quest for hegemony. Professor Lebow, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much. Somehow I feel this is a bit loud. Am I? Can we lower it just a bit? I hear myself ringing in my ears. Yeah, I think that's better. Does it still work for everyone? Thank you very much for your generous introduction and also for the invitation to come both to Oslo and to the workshop in Bergen that follows. And thank you even more for arranging this glorious summer weather. I do appreciate it. Rather than going up to the podium, which I always think separates one from an audience, I'm just going to sit here and talk to you. And I hope that that works. I think you can still see me in the back. For a long time, as I'm now in my 51st year of university teaching, I have been a critic of American foreign policy and also of the principal conceptions that American scholars use to understand foreign policy and international relations. In this book, I've managed, together with my co-author, to bring the two concerns together and to argue that they're quite closely related. My co-author is Simon Reich, who was a graduate student of mine at Cornell in the 1980s and is now a full professor of international relations at Rutgers University in New Jersey. The theme of the book, briefly put, is that the United States never had hegemony, that hegemony is not only unnecessary for global order, but is a threat to global order. I will unpack that in the course of my talk, but I will start by telling you why Simon and I chose the title Goodbye Hegemony. How many of you have seen the film Goodbye Lenin? Well, so allow me, for those of you who have not, the film was made after the unification of Germany, and it has a wonderful conceit. So a brother and sister who are adult have a mother who's grown up. They all live in East Berlin. She's had a heart attack, and she's been in a coma for some months. While in the coma, the Berlin Wall has been breached, East German regime has collapsed, Germany is in the process of being unified. The mother wakes up. The doctors warn the brother and sister that any shock could trigger another infarction, another heart attack. They want to keep her in the hospital. Her children say, no, we want her home. And they realize that they'll have to make it appear that nothing has changed. So they retrofit their flat. They get rid of anything Western in it. They scour the city of East Berlin to find the jar of pickles that she is so addicted to. And they solve the problem of television news with the help of a friend who provides them old tapes of East German broadcasts. This works well until one day, for some reason, real television comes on. And it's West German TV showing a retrospective of the wall being breached and people celebrating with champagne on top. She gets very upset about this, and they reassure all is well. The West Germans have torn down the wall to seek refuge in the East. She's surrounded by friends her age who have known nothing other than East Berlin, who have developed nostalgia about the past because they're singularly ill-equipped to deal with the present, let alone the future. Simon and I argue that this movie might as well be about American hegemony. It's something that never really existed, yet there has been a tacit conspiracy, so to speak, between American policymakers for decades, Democrats and Republicans alike. There's nothing partisan in our critique. And American scholars, most of whom are realists or liberals, the two dominant intellectual paradigms in the American study of international relations. They maintain that hegemony exists and that it's necessary for security and international economic order. In fact, they're maintaining a myth and fostering this illusion on the American people the way the brother and sister did, for more benign reasons, I might add, on their mother. What I'm going to do in my talk is to start by asking what is a hegemon and answering in terms of what the theorists who propagate hegemony argue it is. Then I'm going to say that the US doesn't meet the criteria for hegemony, and moreover, that the US has behaved in ways that contradict what realists and liberals say a hegemon should be doing to maintain international order. I'm then going to unpack the concept of power and argue that this intellectual shortcoming in American international relations theory explains why the delusion of hegemony might be justified. But I'll conclude by suggesting that what it's all about is a claim for special privileges for the United States and higher status. And this is not unique to hegemony. It's equally true of so many other important American approaches to IR, most notably the democratic peace and power transition theory. They're all part of the same package, and none of them should be taken terribly seriously. As you might imagine, one of the reasons I work in the UK, at Dartmouth, I'm a professor emeritus. I retired 5 years ago when I turned 70. That I work in the UK and spend a lot of time on the continent is that neither American scholars nor policymakers have any particular interest, quite the reverse, in hearing what I have to say. I'm accustomed to this. In the Jimmy Carter administration, I was an advisor to the director of the Central Intelligence Agency. And I was also spitting in the wind then, although it was to those who had power, not merely to an academic audience. But the result was roughly the same. So, hegemony, according to realists who write about it, there's a consensus that it is the ability to impose one's preferences on other states in the international system. Since the Roman Empire, there's never been a hegemon in the West. Various states, whether it's Spain under Philip II, France under Louis XIV and Napoleon, or Germany in the 19th and 20th century, have tried to become hegemons. The balance of power has not prevented the wars that they have begun, but it has kept them from winning them. At most, we have seen what might be called dominant powers, states that were primus inter pares because they had considerably more power and influence than others. So France, in the late 17th and really up through the Napoleonic era, and more recently the United States since 1918. But a dominant power is not a hegemon. The one period of history where the US was most powerful was in the aftermath of World War II, when its gross domestic product constituted 36% of the world. It's dropped to, I think, 22% now. And very clearly, it's always had, in the post-1945 period, a very powerful military. But it never had either the power or the ability to impose its preferences on others outside of the Western Hemisphere. And at most, you could say it had a kind of informal condominium in North and South America within reason, but certainly nowhere else. And you might include, for the first decade of the post-war era, Japan and that part of Germany that was occupied by the United States. Clearly, this was an anomaly and the result of the catastrophic destruction of the rest of the world by World War II. By the 60s, matters had changed, and the US might still be the most powerful state in the world, but you may have noticed, and this is one of the themes of my talk I'd like to come back to at the end, that hegemony would have you believe that US power translates into US influence. But in fact, while being the most powerful state in the world, the US is less and less and less able to impose its preferences on others. So there's something else going on here. And the concept of hegemony, rather than helping us understand it, blinds us to the realities of the world. So let's look at why the US doesn't behave as a hegemon. So this is a separate issue. The first one is, does it have the power that realists and liberals attribute to it to be hegemon? And clearly the answer to that is no. And what is it a hegemon is supposed to do in their theories? And does the US do it? And here too, the answer is going to be a resounding no. So for realists, and here I could cite, for those of you who know the literature, people like Michael Maston-Duno, John Mearsheimer, William Wohlforth, and so weiter. I mean, the list is very long. It goes on. They argue that a hegemon is essential to organize the international order, to use carrots and sticks to uphold that order, and to fundamentally provide the leadership that only a very powerful state is capable of doing. Because the small fry couldn't organize themselves out of a paper bag. I mean, that's the assumption. So if you look, the US indeed did establish in the West a series of institutions. But it could only enact major policies, whether in NATO or IMF or any of these other institutions, with the support of other leading members of those organizations. It had to persuade people to do what it wanted to do. And in critical instances, it couldn't do so. One of the more recent examples is, of course, the intervention in Iraq, where the U.S. was decisively spurned by its otherwise closest allies. And we'll come back to why this is so. In fact, the way the U.S. has behaved in terms of its unilateral policies and intervention have led others in the world to see it not as a pillar of stability, but as a threat to the peace. In 2007, there was a BBC poll conducted in Japan, Germany, France, Britain, Italy, the U.S.'s closest allies, and Canada, that found that public opinion considered the U.S. to be a greater threat to the peace of the world than either North Korea or Iran. So the American self-perception is very different from the perception of the rest of the world, and I'm talking here only about America's closest allies. That percentage has changed somewhat since 2007, which was very much in the shadow of the Iraq War. There was an Obama bump that gave America more appeal, but fundamentally there remains a strikingly sharp difference in America's perception of itself and the benefits it provides, and others' perception of the United States. And that in part is due to unilateralism, American rhetoric, and we need only look at the current election to see how many of us in the United States, as well as outside, feel threatened by both candidates. I mean, there's no doubt in my mind that Trump is close to a proto-fascist and would be a disaster to America and the world. So I'm going to vote for Hillary Clinton, but I'm going into the voting booth like that because Hillary is a hardcore interventionist. She wants more rather than less American intervention. This is very clear from her campaign biography and from her public statements. And you only need to listen to her. In recent times, she's was very unhappy that Obama hasn't intervened in Syria, for example. So the U.S. doesn't fit the theoretical, or it doesn't perform the theoretical tasks of hegemony with respect to the strategic domain. In economics, a hegemon, and here liberals and realists draw on the work of Charles Kindleberger, who was a prominent economist at Yale in the 1960s. In fact, I audited one of his courses when I was in graduate school at Yale in the early 60s. Kindleberger argued, with the counterfactual case, that the world depression, or at least its most terrible consequences, could have been avoided had there been a hegemon, had the United States played the role that it aspired to in the post-war period. So a hegemon could have provided leadership, he argues, and countries that sought to protect themselves by erecting tariffs ended up hurting themselves and everybody else because this policy encouraged their neighbors to do the same, which exaggerated the problem. A hegemon might have organized an alternative response and perhaps even coerced reluctant states into joining it. Indeed, much of the American organization at Bretton Woods of the post-war economic order, Western order, was designed to respond to the perceived policy lessons of the 1930s. Secondly, in addition to leadership, a hegemon is supposed to be the lender of last resort, come to the aid of economies that are troubled. The United States is the borrower of the last result. Between 15 and $20 trillion in debt, depending on whose statistics you follow. It supports a living standard above what it can afford by borrowing cheaply from other countries. And one needs only look at the phenomenal amount of debt owed just to Japan and Germany, but collectively to Europe, it's even more. So this is irresponsible economic leadership, which does not help. If one looks at the recent economic crisis, you'll see that to the extent to which we've managed to address it, and I'll come back to this, it was a multilateral effort involving China, the European states, the United States, smaller powers. It was not an effort led or coordinated in any way by one power. And much of what was critical to do, the United States opposed. So not only doesn't it have the power to be a hegemon, as realists and liberals define hegemony, what power it hasn't acted in a responsible way and lived up to the role that realists and liberals attribute to a hegemon. And this gap has become more pronounced since the Cold War for obvious reasons. In the absence of a Soviet threat, the U.S. could proclaim a unilateral world, not that such a thing ever existed, and flex its muscles more to act in ways that it believed, incorrectly I'm going to argue, advance its own interest. In the process, it's hurt itself, and it has led to less rather than more influence. Now, the problem, as I see it, that realists and liberals have, has to do with their focus on power and the belief in the power of power, if you like. Implicitly, they believe that material capabilities, wealth, the wherewithal of a powerful military, that military capabilities lead automatically to power, and that power automatically leads to influence. What Simon and I argue in the book, and it's not the first time I've argued this, is that this is if parsimonious, entirely unrealistic and superficial understanding of how relations work, whether between people or between states. Material capabilities, to be sure, are important and may be one constituent of power. Power is important, but it doesn't necessarily lead to influence. And let me go back and tell you a story here. I was a graduate student at Yale in the early 60s. And in 1963, Thomas Schelling, a famous author of 2 books on bargaining and foreign policy, an economist by training, came to give 3 lectures at Yale, which led to his famous book, Arms and Influence. With a coterie of graduate students, we attended the lectures. So I went with Janice Stein, now a very famous scholar of international relations, and for some decades the advisor to head of the Foreign Policy Advisory Board to 3 or 4 Canadian foreign ministers. Orrin Young, who wrote several books on bargaining, and Nan Cohane, who was a classmate who, of course, became president of several American universities. And we listened to Schelling give this talk. And he was all in favor of threatening violence against North Vietnam to coerce it into restraining the Viet Cong, which is precisely what Lyndon Johnson tried to do and failed. And he told us proudly that the U.S. could drop more bombs on North Vietnam than all belligerents collectively dropped in World War II. An impressive figure. Janice Stein stood up and asked the first question. She said, Professor Schelling, just where are you going to drop the bombs? What targets do you have that would be meaningful other than a few oil refineries? Of course, Schelling didn't have an answer. And I suggested to him that he was only looking at one side of the equation. The U.S. could indeed inflict much pain on North Vietnam. But the other side of the equation, as Clausewitz well knew, is how much pain can you absorb? And if the Vietnamese believe they're fighting for the independence of their country, they're going to be willing to suffer a lot more than American conscripts who have no idea why they're exposing themselves to gunshots in Vietnam. And the U.S. could win every battle and lose the war, which is indeed what happened. So power did not translate into influence, and rarely does in international relations. It is helpful in wielding influence under special conditions. Power may help you persuade, and it's persuasion that leads to influence, and it depends as much on rhetorical skills as it does on power. Most importantly, you are likely to persuade others when you're trying to get them to do something that they see as beneficial to them as well. And by doing this and cooperating, you begin to build common identities. Common identities make it easier to persuade people in the future. I mean, it's one of the ways in which nationalities develop, is through this interactive process. But this means that your power can only be used for purposes that others see as in their interests and legitimate. So influence, while it may enhance your capabilities, has to be restricted to things that you can persuade others to join you in. And invading Iraq is the most dramatic of many examples where it doesn't work, because those you wish to persuade did not see it in either their interest or in the interest of the international community. And indeed, and this is a theme that should be close to the heart of the Nobel Institute, the use of force internationally in the absence of authorization from appropriate regional and international institutions has become increasingly unacceptable. So by using force in Iraq, the U.S. may have demonstrated its power. Remember, it was called the campaign of shock and awe, but in the process lost influence because it was using its power for what was seen as an illegitimate purpose. So one needs to think of influence, not power, and to think of the many factors, not just power, that enable or prevent influence from being exercised. And the U.S., I think, regardless of whether it's Trump or Clinton who wins, is beginning to behave like a dinosaur. And one of the great Gary Larson cartoons of all time, I thought, was a lecture hall like this, filled by dinosaurs, with a dinosaur lecturer with a cigarette in his hand. And all the members of the audience also had cigars, pipes, and cigarettes. And the caption underneath read, "Why the dinosaurs are extinct." If the United States keeps choosing to spend 10 times as much on its military as other states, and using that military to intervene, because once you have it, you have to intervene to justify the expenditure, it will act in ways that are increasingly detrimental to itself economically and politically. And like the dinosaurs or the Soviet Union, it will risk catastrophic consequences. The only way around this is having conceptions that are more appropriate to the world. And here I'd like to suggest that hegemony is not necessary for either economic or strategic management. That it's far better in a world where equality has become the central value. It's far better to have multilateral action, often in the form of cooperation, but sometimes not, where different actors feel that they own pieces of the puzzle and contribute to strategic and economic stability. That the U.S. can play an important role here, but more by being quiet and providing resources when others consider what they're doing. And I'll just give you two examples, one an historical one a counterfactual. Consider advances like the right to protect or the landmines treaty, both opposed by the United States. And yet the so-called small fry were able to organize countries like Norway, which took an active role in this, Austria, Belgium, Canada, to create enough of an international consensus that the U.S. at some point realized it was no longer in its interest to oppose this because it would be left in the dark. Better to join it in the hope it could limit the consequences of either the treaty or the right to protect. So even in the security sphere, one can make a strong case against realist claims. Secondly, I'll offer you a counterfactual. Counterfactual is very close to my heart, and I've written 2 books on them. Look at the problem the U.S. has had in trying to, quote, manage North Korea and its proliferation. The U.S. has turned that conflict into, if I may cite Dean Rusk, an eyeball-to-eyeball confrontation between Washington and Pyongyang. The U.S. keeps pushing publicly, as well as privately, China to put pressure on North Korea. Well, what incentive does China have to appear to be doing the bidding of the U.S. and, moreover, on Washington's orders? So imagine, instead, that the U.S. at some point had quietly conferred with China and then also with other Asian players and said, look, we all know that this North Korean regime constitutes a threat to all of us for a variety of strategic and economic reasons. China, this is in your backyard. And why don't you take the lead in dealing with it? And anything you want us to do to help, we're happy to do it. Or just keep our mouth shut and let you deal with it. In that circumstance, the Chinese might well have seen a very strong incentive both to curb North Korea, because it's in their interest too, but also to display regional leadership. But if you're committed to hegemony and you believe that allowing China to do something, even though it might promote stability, that would appear to confer some mantle of leadership on it is threatening in the long run to American hegemony, you don't even think of it. Instead, you're busy organizing a so-called balance of power against China in Asia, which has the effect of making Chinese fears, which are already there, self-fulfilling. Mind you, if I were giving a lecture about China, I'd argue the Chinese are playing an equally stupid game, which is playing right into the hands of American hardliners who need a Chinese enemy if they're going to justify this enormous military instrument that they have. So we're left with the question of why it is that American leaders and scholars have been so blind. Leaders, I'm not surprised about, they're always blind, or most of them are. But there also is an explanation here. Part of America's self-image, one of its national identifications, and one from which citizens derive great self-esteem. And we know in the modern era, Morgenthau and Lasswell, Harold Lasswell is one of the great theorists of the 20th century who's no longer read, argued that there is this huge transference in the modern era of people onto their states. Same thing is true with their sports teams. You know, when Norway wins a soccer match, people in this country feel, proud and fulfilled. Like people in every other country. I'm not picking on the Norwegians here, who maybe win fewer matches. Although I shouldn't talk about the American soccer team. And the English, we won't go there. So, encouraging American leadership has been, in the first instance, a means of building national esteem and winning political support. And the two have become so linked that any kind of project that makes it appear that America is taking a back seat rather than leading opens you up to criticism. And look at the way people have gone after Obama, whether it's over Libya or over Syria. And in both cases, Hillary was arguing for a far more active policy. So that's the first reason. The second reason is, and we can't escape it, that hegemony justifies military spending. And in the absence of that and of making China a threat, it would be far more difficult to justify this extraordinary expenditure. My undergraduate international relations theory mentor and then my later friend and colleague, Hans Morgenthau, argued that international relations theory should speak truth to power. Instead, what realists and liberals do is hope to whisper in the ears of policymakers by telling them what they want to hear or what will flatter them. Hegemony does exactly this. It provides a justification for American exceptionalism. And if you think that during the Cold War, the claim to be a superpower essentially was the same. And even though they were adversaries, the Soviet Union and the United States conspired with each other to recognize the other as a co-superpower because they both gained vis-a-vis their respective alliances. In the absence of the Soviet Union, the US has tried to establish this new category of status called a hegemon and to get others to agree that it is. And here, too, it's a claim for special privileges and one that hasn't sold well at all. Sort of the Edsel of international relations, if you're familiar with the Ford car that was a disaster in the 1960s and at great expense. And hegemony is not the only concept that my colleagues have spawned toward this end. There's the democratic peace. The claim that democracies don't fight other democracies, which is cited all the time by Republicans, but even more by Democrats, and used as a justification for imposing regimes or regime change, even though the regimes they put in place are not democracies, but it's used for that end, and people like John Eikenberry have supported the creation of a League of Democracies and to fundamentally impose by fiat order on the world. Now, the democratic peace is, my personal view is that it is an interesting but far from proven hypothesis. It may be simply a statistical artifact. It may be that developed countries don't fight other developed countries, and most developed countries are democracies. It may be that there are no wars among democracies, particularly since 1945, because they're all in the American alliance, and the Americans won't let them fight one another. And it may also be that there have been wars among democracies. It all depends how you code them. And of course, Bruce Russett is the slipperiest of all when it comes to coding, whether it's deterrence or democratic peace. No consideration that Wilhelmine in Germany was a democracy. Independent judiciary, free elections, universal suffrage, a parliament, respect for human rights in the courts. By and in some ways it wasn't, that the Kaiser had control over foreign and military policy. All the Reichstag could do was not fund it, which of course was a lot of power. India and Pakistan, if you look at the cases of so many of the democratic peace theorists, when they're at war, they're not democracies. They're democracies in some periods when there's peace. The Boer War is not counted as a war because the Boers, they claim, weren't recognized by enough other states to make them legally a state. So they weasel out of every case that might not fit because they're driven more by ideology than they are by science. So I'm agnostic about the democratic peace, but it's taken by theorists, and one of the nice papers at our workshop shows how overwhelmingly the IR profession believes in the robustness of the democratic peace. And finally, we come to power transition theory, which is the biggest whopper of them all. So power transition theory asserts, I need like 5 minutes and then I'm done. Is that within the time limit? Power transition theory asserts that whenever a power is rising to the point where it could challenge a dominant power, a hegemon, that war breaks out. Depending on which variant you take, it's the dominant power who goes to war to prevent the rising power from doing this before it gets too strong, or it's the rising power when it feels its oats who takes on the dominant power. And they all cite the Peloponnesian War between Athens and Sparta as proof of this, misreading completely Thucydides, but I've written another book on that. I won't go into this now, but ignoring, in fact, that the dominant power in the region was Persia, not either Sparta or Athens. They miscode various cases there. I've written a book on this called Why Nations Fight. And there is no historical evidence anywhere of a war of power transition. Transitions occur as the result of wars. They're not the cause of them. That dominant powers and rising powers frequently go to war, but against declining great powers and smaller states, never against one another. And yet, this lens, without any historical support, is being applied to China. And most recently, by a really scurrilous piece in The Atlantic by Graham Allison called The Thucydides Trap, which was cited by both President Obama and President Hu of China, arguing that we can avoid this. And Allison, one of his prime examples, is the Japanese American component of World War II, arguing that it was started by Japan to supplant the United States. Does anybody know the difference between Japanese and American GDP in 1941? The United States had 11 times the gross national product of Japan. There was no power transition anywhere in sight, and the American economy was growing at a faster rate, moreover, than the Japanese. It's utter nonsense. So, together with a classicist, contacted The Atlantic and said, we'd like to write a piece opposing Graham Allison. You've printed something which has no historical support, but which has important policy consequences. So they agreed. And we wrote an article called The Thucydides Claptrap, in which we just exposed the arguments of Allison as being based on no historical fact whatsoever and flying in the face of the range of interpretations that historians thought were reasonable, that Allison was out here. So it went through was accepted, went through 3 rounds of editing, and then they came back and edited on their own a 4th time, removing most of our criticisms of Allison. And they went to a 5th and 6th version and then rejected it on the grounds that they couldn't be certain of our facts. And I have provided the data set from my book as our evidence. And the book has been reviewed and people have supported and criticized it, but both critics and reviewers have said that the data set was very nicely put together. It's now coming out in the Atlantic Monthly. But clearly what happened, somebody intervened at the Atlantic, and they didn't publish a piece which flew in the face of the conventional wisdom. It's like putting the tape of the East German news in the television set and not allowing anybody who suggests, no, here's some real news that should go on television, to play it. So this is part of a broader piece in which the Americans are subjecting themselves to conceptions and information which are increasingly detached from the real world. My mentor at Yale as a graduate student was Carl Deutsch, who was very interested in cybernetic theory. And he argued that the propensity for a system to fail is largely a product of its preference for internal over external feedback. And that's exactly what's happened to American international relations theory and the debate about foreign policy in the national security establishment. Thank you.
Professor Lebow, you make me feel bad for taking the rostrum now that you're being much more humble than I am. We will have...
And do call me Ned.
Yes, well, Ned. We will take a 10-minute break, recharge our glasses, and then return for questions and answers. And please indicate to me if you want to pose a question. Thank you very much. Questions come from Professor Maya Davis-Cross, one of our visiting fellows.
Thank you very much. Thank you for that great presentation, which covered a lot of ground. I have a couple of questions for you. The first one is more about IR theory and your conception of hegemony, because it seemed to me that maybe the bar for the definition of hegemony is very high. First of all, you're saying that in order to be a hegemon, a state has to sort of be able to exercise its will and get others to...
I'm not saying this.
Okay.
This is what the realists and liberals who argue for the need of hegemony and that America is a hegemon, this is their definition of what hegemony is, not mine.
Okay, well, I guess when I think about hegemony, I don't think of it in the way that is such a high bar. But so what I'm essentially wondering is whether sort of using the other terminology that you suggested, dominant power, in your mind then would work for basically this argument. And in particular, the second part I wanted to pick up on in this question is your use of the term a responsible power, because when you think about a dominant power or a hegemon, you don't necessarily assume, one doesn't necessarily assume that it is always going to make choices that are somehow responsible or will benefit itself.
Quite the reverse.
Right. And so, even the Roman Empire would do things that were irresponsible and do things that also involved persuasion and so on. So that's kind of the first question is would you be, if you took the dominant power approach instead, would there be more room for kind of conceptualizing of the role of the U.S., that indeed you would admit that the U.S. is a dominant power, at least in the international system? And then,
let me answer the first question.
Sure.
Because that's quite a bit
Absolutely.
right away.
Go ahead.
So there's no doubt that if we use the language dominant power, it would be a more accurate description of the United States. It would, however, bring with it the need to reconceptualize America's role in the world, because dominant powers can't do what hegemons are expected to do. As a dominant power, you might provide leadership, but right up front, you'd have to recognize that that leadership depends upon persuading others to join you in these complex and often resource-rich tasks. It also suggests that rather than having its maximal preferences and trying to impose them on others, the U.S. would have to learn to compromise with others and seek more moderate goals. In effect, it would require a reconceptualization of American policy, which is why I believe there is resistance to thinking about it as a dominant versus a hegemonic power. So we're on the same page in that regard. And again, one has to ask, why is it that we're using an inappropriate term? And it's clear that it's because it provides a justification for special privileges and interventionist policies.
Great, thank you. And my second question is about your discussion on military power. Mm-hmm. And I completely agree with you that, the excessive spending by the United States is counterproductive and so on. And I'm just wondering to what extent, though, military power does, in your view, at its core, have a kind of attractive power. I'm thinking of sort of the literature Joseph Nye has spawned with this idea that having military power, even if it just sits there and you don't make bad decisions about using it, attracts others because they admire an efficient, effective military, and you can also use your military power in soft power ways, training other countries' militaries and so on.
May I answer that one? So I think Joe Nye's conception is as soft as his notion of soft power. Let's deconstruct soft power. According to Joe, the U.S. has add-on influence because so many people around the world admire the U.S., adopt American practices and American products, and watch, Hollywood films. And you have to ask yourself, how true is this? Do all of us who eat Italian food, does that make us more receptive to Italian foreign policy? And the answer is obviously no. Soft power can and has existed in the past, and perhaps the greatest example of it was the Soviet Union in the 20s and 30s, and even in the 40s, where large numbers of people outside the Soviet Union believed that it was the future and were willing to act in ways to advance Soviet interest. One needs only think of the French and Italian communist parties and their influence in their respective countries as an example. Today, it's a kind of irony with respect to the U.S. Every demonstration I've ever seen against the United States is carried out by people who are wearing American jeans. To the extent they watch American television, they're just as likely to watch The Daily Show and South Park, which certainly are not designed to support American foreign policy, quite the reverse. Joe Nye has never told us how soft power, why it exists, how it can be measured. This is all, again, puffery to build up American self-esteem. And on Joe's part, it's motivated by a benign desire to reduce American reliance on military power. I think that's what motivated him to, I give him the credit for this, to advance the soft power concept. But as a concept, it really doesn't get anywhere. As for your first question, that people admire us because of our military power, I think quite the reverse. People fear us because of our military power. That it's a waste of money, that U.S. security would have been advanced in the Cold War and would be more advanced today with fewer fighter groups, aircraft carriers, divisions. All this military power just doesn't sit there. It's used. And it's used, as I noted, because you have to use it to justify it. But it has more subtle effects. If you see you have this much military power, you're much more likely to use it as an instrument than to think about diplomatic and other ways of resolving problems. You're more likely to posit maximal demands and think it's less necessary for you to compromise. You're more likely to stick your nose in businesses around the world, as Hillary Clinton wants to do, and by doing so, dissipate what influence you have. Military power has been consistently destructive to the United States since the end of World War II. The United States, I'm not suggesting the United States disarm, but a military that was 10% of what we would have would suit our purposes much better. Yeah, you have people here.
Thank you. Jeff Taliaferro, Tufts University. Ned, thank you so much for your remarks, and thank you so much for a number of very, very thought-provoking books on international politics over the years. I've read your work since I was an undergraduate in the 1980s. But let me ask two sets of questions. One concerns terminology, and it's sort of a follow-on to some of the questions which Maya raised. And the second concerns the consequences of how the United States behaves in the world. I think that in this talk and in this book, you really tackle, or attempt to tackle, two of the most quarrelsome and contentious concepts in the study of international relations: hegemony and power. And one can come up with several dozen mutually contradictory definitions and conceptions of each. And I agree with your critique of some of the literature about hegemony, both realists and liberals, who blithely talk about hegemony as if they actually had a consensus as to what it meant. But the reality is that they don't.
But
the reality is that they don't, that many times they're talking past one another. They're talking at cross purposes. And the same thing with power. Now, I am not sure, and I'm actually quite sure, that no self-described realist would say that having material power automatically gives a state complete control of a situation. They tend to say, even structural realists, even neo-realists would say that on average bargaining outcomes tend to mirror the relative distribution of capabilities among the actors, leaving open the possibility that there are going to be plenty of situations, such as the Vietnam War, in which, despite overwhelming capabilities, a very powerful actor like the United States ultimately doesn't get its way, because preponderant military power is not going to produce a desired outcome from the standpoint of the U.S. when you have a much smaller adversary which attaches tremendous value to national unification. But I'd like to, well, there's so many.
could I just respond to what you've said so far?
Yes, please.
And then you can have a second round?
Okay.
All right. So power is indeed a contested concept, but less so than you think among realists. If you look at Morgenthau's categories of what constitutes power, Ken Waltz offers the same categories. The difference, interestingly, is not a conceptual one among realists, but an empirical one. There's widespread consensus about what power is, but realists disagree about the polarity of the world. Now, as an aside, I think it's irrelevant, polarity. It doesn't tell you anything. They think it does. So there are some realists who follow Ken Waltz in believing that the world is still bipolar because only the Soviets, the Russians, and the US have the strategic capability to destroy the world. There are other realists, perhaps the majority, who now believe the world is multipolar. And then there's the Dartmouth school, Mastenduno, Brooks, Wohlforth, who believe that the world is unipolar. They all start from the same understanding of what power is. But in fact, it's so badly specified that you can't possibly measure it in a way that you can temperature. Let me just take 2 minutes here and elaborate this. Forgive me, it's a long answer, but it's a very thoughtful question. So Fahrenheit, Celsius, Kelvin can all be exchanged. And presumably, if there were aliens with physics, whatever measures they had, we could translate it as well, because it ultimately refers to something real. The energy level and movement of molecules. That's what temperature is about. Balance of power refers to nothing. It's a reification. It's an idea that's based on power. What's power based on? Well, you might take material capabilities. we can come up with completely different understandings of what material capabilities are, and then we'd have to have measures for weighting them. So if we have everybody in the room calculate this, we're not going to come up with any measure that's interchangeable the way temperature is. And Ken Waltz and Morgenthau both so underspecify what they mean by polarity that it goes like this. So yes, there's all this disagreement, but it's because the theorization is so bad, but the concept is rather unitary and accepted. When it comes to hegemony, I opened the book by going through a half a dozen both realist and liberal definitions of what hegemony is. They're all basically the same. The ability to impose your preferences on others. Now, nobody is saying, and I'm certainly not creating a false standard for realists, I certainly don't believe, and I don't think that they believe, and you're right in saying this, that the fact that you have material capabilities means you're going to win every time, right? After all, Barcelona loses football games, doesn't it? And yet it's clear it's the best team in the league, and anybody who's watched Messi play in the current round of competition knows that he's the best football player around and only one that makes Barcelona so good. That's true. I'm not so much debating outcomes as I am the conceptions that lead realists to expect a certain range of outcomes and to greatly overvalue material capabilities and greatly overvalue what they consider power and to ignore entirely influence. And here too there's an intellectual as well as political reason why they do it. Power is something they think that can be measured objectively. Influence is by definition situation specific. So we all know the game of rock, scissors, and paper. And it depends on context. A may have influence over B and B over C, but C may have influence over A. You couldn't have a parsimonious theory of international relations if you focused on influence, not on power. And American realists and liberals would rather be empirically impoverished, but theoretically robust. And that's what I'm arguing against.
Thank you. The second question, and I'll try to be more succinct.
You were very clear.
Thank you. The second question concerns the consequences of how the United States behaves in the world, how the United States has behaved in the world over the past 7 decades. Right. You've cited the examples of the Vietnam War. You've cited the examples of the 2003 Iraq invasion, subsequent occupation.
You can ask, aside from Korea, which they also messed up, any American intervention, maybe Grenada aside, that's been successful.
And you'll get no, I mean, I've written on many of these, you'll get no, I'm not a cheerleader for American intervention abroad, and many times
I didn't think you were.
They're very, the reasons why leaders go to war, particularly wars against small countries, has less to do with an objective calculation of material capabilities than it does with their fears of losing prestige, standing, etc.
I agree completely.
But in terms of outcomes, if American foreign policy is so deleterious for the United States, I'm not talking about people who happen to live in Iraq or Syria or Libya, but if it's so deleterious for the United States, what are the real consequences? I mean, what are the real costs? I mean, relative to other great powers in modern history, Spain, France, Germany, Japan, the former Soviet Union, if the United States has been consistently pursuing sets of military policies and foreign policies that are so disastrous, what tangible costs has the United States actually incurred?
Well, what do you think?
Relative to those other great powers, the costs have been relatively low.
Yes, that's true. And the reason for it is the U.S. has not tried to conquer the world. The U.S. has been more restrained relative to Philip II, Louis XIV, Napoleon, Hitler. The consequences for these states were much greater, catastrophic in the case of the Germans, over the period of centuries, catastrophic for Spain, less so for France, and less so for the US. If the US tried to conquer the world, indeed there would be problems as well. My argument is that by going off the reservation and acting in irresponsible ways, the US has damaged itself. The fact that it's damaged itself less than other dominant powers in the world doesn't make it any more acceptable. And it's damaged itself less for the two reasons. One I mentioned is that it hasn't been as extreme in its pursuit of hegemony as these other states. And secondly, it's richer. But one need only look at the state of American education, healthcare, the gap between the rich and the poor. In any number of measures, the US is falling behind much of the rest of the Western world. And part of that has to do with the extraordinary waste of blood and treasure that have been expended in pursuit of the illusory goal of hegemony. That's a heavy price.
Yes, Geir Lundestad, professor of history for many years, now retired. I like your presentation, Ned, particularly your criticism of everybody else. The difficulty, of course, is constructing your own ideas. I'm not so sure that I would want to get into the endless discussion of hegemony or empire or leading power or whatever, because so much depends on the definition. But clearly, the United States has, in most respects, had more power militarily, economically, culturally, than virtually all the powers we call empires. The situation of the United States after 1945 is often compared to Britain's situation after the Napoleonic Wars. There's no comparison.
Agreed.
Because the United States was so much stronger. Mm-hmm. But let that be. What I missed in your presentation, as in so many American presentations, is how the outside world then responded to this American policy. The assumption in your presentation is that the world responded negatively. But you didn't really go into any sort of detail on this point, so much was left unsaid. As an historian who has spent some years of my life working on empire by invitation, I'm not arguing that, all great powers decide what policy to pursue on their own. They don't do things because they are persuaded by others. But it is of great interest how the rest of the world responded to this. And that's why I've been arguing that the remarkable thing about the United States is how well much of the world responded to these American actions. I mean, World War I, World War II, the whole situation after 1945, where the Europeans virtually begged for assistance. Mm-hmm. And it's not true what you read in all these American histories that the United States founded NATO. It did not. It definitely did not. It had to be persuaded by the Europeans to set up NATO. Okay. And you saw the same situation, after the end of the Cold War. What happened to the Central and Eastern Europeans? Well, they wanted to rush into NATO and EU and American assistance and American culture and you name it. And now you see you referred briefly to this, you see some of the same mechanisms in Asia. There it is clearly related to the rise of China, but it's still happening. And the most persuasive evidence, just to cut this short, is that take Afghanistan. I mean, we all kind of think that Afghanistan was a failure in most respects. It's still a failure. But why did 50 to 60 countries put forces into Afghanistan to support the United States? They didn't do it primarily because of the Afghans. They did it primarily, and now of course we have an official report on this in Norway. Reason number one, which most of us have argued all the time, was of course to maintain the best possible relations to the United States. And this went for all the others too. Sweden, Finland, the whole shebang.
All true, but in no way detracts from my argument.
Well, no, because you left the foreigners out.
No, well, I didn't. I did mention...
You mentioned some Gallipolis.
No, I mentioned some of the big differences in perception that Americans have of themselves and others have of the United States and its foreign policy. But let's come to the post-war era. And one can look at the glass as half full or half empty. You've tried to make the case that it's almost entirely full. And there I don't agree. In 1945, there's no doubt that the US was welcomed as a liberator around the world. And with good reason. The US has, if I can use a crude expression here, pissed away the influence that it achieved through its victory in World War II by consistently supporting right-wing regimes around the world. Excuse me, in Italy, in Spain, in Greece, in Turkey, right-wing regimes. Yes, Italy. Christian Democrats were, in the immediate post-war period, a right-wing and non-democratic group that used often extra-legal means supported by the United States against their opponents. And in the case of Spain, Portugal, Greece, and Turkey, it's more blatant. The United States, by going to bed with dictators from Korea to Iran and also in Central America, created a situation where when these regimes ran into trouble, the US was so closely associated with them that it became the great Satan and the object of dislike. This is a result of American policies, of intervening in a crude political and military way, rather than just saying we're great supporters of democracy and we're willing to help states in ways that are meaningful but non-interventionist. Now, in Western Europe, on the whole, they did this. And it's why Western Europe is both successful and has a close relationship with the United States of the kind that the Soviet Union could only envy with respect to its Warsaw Pact, quote, allies. The US provided resources, and it was unable to intervene in a way that it would have liked. And also there was some self-restraint for cultural reasons. But elsewhere, the US consistently behaved in ways that were at odds with its values and gave rise to what we now call counterpower. When you catch someone who's proclaimed its adherence to a particular set of values and then consistently violates them, it leaves itself open to rhetorical and other kinds of attacks. So in this sense, the glass is not very full. The glass is only full when you compare it to how other would-be hegemons have behaved. And here the US has undeniably behaved better. And it's behaved better, I think, for several reasons. The first is that it had the resources to govern through informal arrangements rather than formal direct ones. Its power was masked more effectively, which is very important. Secondly, it lives in an age of equality when empire, now Ferguson aside, is a laughable concept and unacceptable to publics anywhere. So it didn't have that choice and wouldn't have exercised it in any case. Thirdly, it is a liberal democratic country, which makes it more difficult to behave the way the Soviet Union did in Eastern Europe and square it with your values, although it seems to me the U.S. has managed successfully to do this in the course of a number of interventions. So it's a complex issue in which the U.S. gets good and bad grades. And when you read standard treatments of American policy, consider John Eikenberry's 3 most recent books, you only get the good side of it. And what I've been doing, and Simon in Goodbye Hegemony, is saying, look, there's a downside too, and this downside should be faced because it's an important truth.
Yes, of course.
Yeah. So is that it, you think, or somebody else keen to ask a question?
A few more.
Thank you. Retired from the Ministry of Foreign Affairs, not you, I. Now, very much food for thought in your lecture, and of course, I think we all agree in the general warning that dominant powers, hegemons, or any as a military power, should not get accustomed to be too dependent upon excessive use of military force. Clearly. Still, if you go back to what Frederick the Great said in 1760s, fighting his 7 years of war, he said something like that: diplomacy without military power is like an orchestra without instrument. And I think still that holds good. I don't think the world, morally, ethically, really has changed that much since the 1960s, 1760s, that still hold. And going into the use of military power, of course, military power has not got so complicated that every dominant military power simply is bound to plan the use of military power for a number of objectives, for a number of reasons. That means, of course, that you have to have a certain range of options military. Of course, that will also tend to blow up the military reservoir. Now, if you think of the poor dominant power who is now warned not to use your military power too much, that makes eminent sense. Still, there are situations where, of course, the dominant military power is called upon, invited, encouraged by whom to use his military power.
When was the last time that happened?
No, but if you well, history, I think it happens in.
It's happening in East Asia.
If you take the encouragement to use the U.S. Navy as a counterweight to Chinese military power in the South Sea, in the southern China Sea, you see it very many other reasons. And then I think it is very hard for the dominant power then to explain to his allies, look, chaps, I have to be careful using my military power too much, because his allies definitely will want him to use his military power. I just mentioned this as an element in the deliberations. Thank you.
All right, let's start with the Frederick the Great and Prussian example, because I'd like to turn that on its head. Frederick the Great spent 92% of his available resources on the military. He turned Prussia into a garrison state. He had far-reaching territorial ambitions. He emerged as a matter of luck from the 7 Years' War, not crushed, but with his hold on Silesia guaranteed. He is a bad example in so many ways because of the militarization of his country and because... Rather than being a necessity, he's the anomaly. So Prussia under Frederick the Great is a pathological state of affairs. It's not something one should generalize from, unless it's an example of how not to behave. The United States given what it spends on the military. It's not the same percentage that Frederick the Great spent, but it's way out of proportion to anybody else or to American needs. Now,
In absolute terms, not in GDP terms.
no,
I mean, the United States doesn't even meet Paul Kennedy's definition of overstretch.
yeah, no, I understand. And of course, Paul Kennedy got it completely wrong. He thought it was the U.S. that was going to collapse, not the Soviet Union. So much for Paul. The point here is that it's hard to come up with historical cases where there has been a consensus for the U.S. to use military force. What you have happened is that right-wing political parties and right-wing regimes have often urged the U.S. to use military force for purposes that advance their parochial interests. And often the tail has wagged the dog. It's further true, and here too international relations theorists are to blame, Tom Schelling among them, developing the notion that the U.S. had to demonstrate its resolve, or others would think it would be weak and bandwagon with its adversary. John Kennedy felt this strongly in the missile crisis. But we know the Soviets never doubted American resolve, and Khrushchev, among other Soviet leaders, thought that they were absolutely risk-prone and crazy. It had the reverse effect than IR theorists and Kennedy thought it would have. In fact, the Cuban Missile Crisis was provoked by a series of escalating crises, with each side thinking it had to demonstrate resolve to the other, leading to the Cuban Missile Crisis. The dynamics here are very clear from the history of the Cold War and other conflicts, and they're the reverse of what you two gentlemen are saying.
Well, I have a few questions myself, but keeping in line with my own set of principles, and that is that we're Norwegians, we end things on time. I suggest that you all join me in a big round of applause for Ned Lebow and for his lecture. Thank you so much.